it's not good to chase status symbols. So if something is not something that you personally enjoy, but you want to signal to others, that's usually not the best use of money.
The biggest asset that rich people have are poor people.
One of the biggest resources that rich people have is the ability to short the currency. If there are people that, lack of better options, holding currency that you're shorting, you're kind of gradually extracting value from that. They're shorting the thing that other people are earning their wages in. Debasement is historically a type of tax that developed countries will be growing at historically 6 to 8% per year. In developing countries, it's often over 10%. Everybody's savings are getting debased. As you increase the money supply, those who are on the right side of deficits are doing pretty well, and those who are not receiving the deficits are the ones getting debased. Always kind of ask the question, am I being diluted? In a lot of economic circles, you'll hear that, okay, barter existed, that's filled with frictions, and so people invented money to get around that problem. But then there's some pushback against that by people pointing out that actual barter was fairly rare in history.
Money is a big part of our life. Most people struggle to answer the most basic question. What is money?
Got the whole crypto world going wild. Money blockchain, she's the queen of the game. Stacking crypto like it's her claim to fame. If you want success, then take a look away.
Okay, today I'm so happy. Oh my God. I'm joined by Lyn Alden, one of the most trusted voices in macro and finance. She has a very rare background in both engineering and finance and known for making sense of how money, debt, and technology shape our world in a way that everyday people can understand. And she was the lead engineer, correct me if I'm wrong, at the FAA's cockpit simulation facility before launching. Yeah, so cool. Before launching Lyn Alden Investment Strategy and her book, Broken Money, walk us through the past, present, and the future of money. And her work has been featured on CNBC, the Wall Street Journal, and of course now finally on Bonnie Blockchain. So excited! I've been dying to have you on the show, Lyn.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
There's so much I want to talk about, but I'm hoping that this video could be, a really good introduction of your ideas, your book, and knowledge to the Chinese-speaking world. And then I'll have an excuse to have you on again.
Sure.
So, first question. Money is a big part of our lives, right? But you know how most people struggle to answer the most basic question, what is money?
Yeah, good question. So I argue in the book that money is a ledger. And basically what that does is that kind of combines two theories of what money is. So in one camp, basically there's commodity money, the idea that, people basically find a commodity that works pretty well as money. It's divisible, it's portable, it's fungible, it's pretty hard to make more of. Different commodity monies come in contact with each other and the best one wins. That historically became gold and silver. That's kind of one camp of what money is. The other one is the idea that money is credit. You don't often even need to exchange physical things. Like if you have an economy where someone makes bread and someone makes beef, basically you can get the bread maker can buy beef and then give bread credits to the butcher, and then that person can go and redeem them for bread at a later time. So it's kind of it smooths out trade. And what they both have in common is that they're basically ledgers. And so commodity money uses nature as a ledger. And credit uses either informal groups as basically the ones maintaining the ledger, or on a larger scale, institutions and governments maintaining that ledger. And one of the things I focus on in Broken Money is that technology can substantially change what makes sense to use as a ledger. And so one of the things I kind of emphasize in the book is that prior to the telecommunication age, some types of monies made sense, and post the telecom age, which of course we're in now, substantially changes what works as money.
So you talked about credit, and there is an idea I find really interesting that you wrote in the book, flexible social credit. So this goes back to the history, right? People keep track of who is helpful in the society and who's a burden, and that becomes a formal credit that affects how easy people participate in financial activities. Can you explain that idea?
Sure, and that was basically I was tackling a concept that comes up sometimes in economic debates, which is in a lot of economic circles you'll hear that, okay, barter existed, that's filled with frictions, and so people invented money to get around that problem. But then there's some pushback against that by people pointing out that actual barter was fairly rare in history based on what we know of history and what we even can study from hunter-gatherers, that generally speaking, there's relatively low volumes of barter, and that instead they tend to rely on credit as the actual medium of transfer. And in very small groups, that's very informal. The example I use in the book is in the movie Godfather. Vito Corleone, the mob boss, someone comes and asks him for a favor in the famous opening scene of the movie. And instead of asking money to do that favor, he basically says, there will be a time in the future, and the future might never come, where I might ask you for a favor. And you'll do that favor for me. So basically, an exchange happened. Nothing physically traded hands, but it was saying in the future I might call on you. And that, outside of the mob context, that is common in friend groups. That is common in neighbor groups. That was common in hunter-gatherer groups based on current and historical evidence. And then as you go up the stack of economic complexity, you start to institutionalize that more. You start to have third-party arbiters that basically enforce laws or enforce claims like that. And that's basically how we've historically built the financial stack.
Do you think that's fair? Because if someone is actually helpful for the society, then that person should be able to get, financial help or participate in financial activities easier. I think that sounds fair.
Yeah, I mean that's a normal. It's part of the incentive structure of working in groups. That basically when things are going well for you, you try to give more than you get out of it because there could be some future time where you're impaired in some way, and you might need other people to help you. And if you've had a history of providing a surplus, you're more likely to be given aid when you need to be given a surplus. And then of course there's different social structures for some people are in a position where they can't realistically provide a surplus through no fault of their own. Family helps them out, and so it becomes reliant on someone who's associated with that person to provide a surplus, or certain types of things that are considered acceptable to help each other in, which different societies navigate. But basically, both reputation-wise, but then also when you expand the groups so you don't even know people anymore, liquid money just kind of serves as the glue that ties a lot of that together as people seek what they're really after, which is other types of capital, shelter, food, entertainment, luxuries, things like that. And the ledgers we use are basically a way of communicating between ourselves, how we acquire those and how we transfer those.
And you also talked about how telecom and money has this interesting relationship in the book.
Yeah, so prior to the invention of the telegraph, which happened in the 1830s, and it really wasn't deployed in long distances to like the 1860s, and worldwide didn't hit to the 1900s. But before that time period, basically as different commodity monies came in contact with each other, so shells and copper and livestock and whatever people might use as money, as they all kind of came together, as all the different cultures found each other, it was really gold and silver that emerged as the best ones. And the main metric there is high stock to flow ratios, basically things that are very long lasting, divisible, portable, and very, very hard to substantially increase the supply of. Even as we get better at making more tools, as we get more industrialized, it's still hard to make gold, for example, to mine more gold and refine it out of the ground compared to industrial processes of getting shells or other types of commodities. And so for the longest time, for thousands of years, people gravitated toward the monies that have the best characteristics, mainly in terms of liquid scarcity. The big game changer that happened is the invention of the telegraph, and then subsequently, of course, the telephone, radio, internet, all these other technologies, which is suddenly speed mattered. Prior to that, all these commodities moved around at roughly the same speed. Shells and gold can exchange hands roughly at the same speed. Whereas in the telecom era, we entered a very different types of ledgers, where people can make a transfer over an ocean within seconds. And the physical settlement of something like gold, especially when audited and the whole process of legally transferring it can take a very long period of time and be very expensive. And so what that did was that shifted global society more toward bank ledgers, central bank ledgers, and nation state ledgers, which really changed the power dynamic of how money works and kind of put us into a new era. Basically, we entered a period where prior to that time, transaction speeds were generally faster than settlement speeds in the sense that various technologies like bills of exchange, paper banknotes, these kind of proxies for money, they did kind of grease the frictions of exchange, but only to a certain degree. Because you're still literally exchanging paper instead of exchanging, maybe metal coins in some capacity. But once you have that telecom component, you dramatically increase the speed of transactions, but you still have the problem of final settlement. Who do you rely on to arbitrate the ledger without credit? And so for something like a century and a half, we were in this period of time where transaction speeds could move at the speed of light, and settlement speeds were still physical. We're still moving at the speed of matter. And not until the invention of Bitcoin and then the adoption of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin, when it was worth zero, still didn't really matter yet in the macro scale. But once it becomes a $1 trillion asset, it starts to matter. So we kind of finally closed the speed gap by Satoshi inventing fast settlement. Basically, the ability to send someone value that can't be pulled back and that is not reliant on some sort of central ledger like a central bank or a commercial bank managing that. And so, we kind of can categorize money into three categories of time. So one was pre-telecom, mostly commodity money and formal credit. Then the middle stage, which was kind of this rise of banking and rise of central banking. And then the current era, where, because of the invention of Bitcoin, we now have other methods to basically decentralize even the bottom layer and actually start closing that speed gap that has existed for a century and a half and has spawned, both opportunities and downsides along the way.
The three era you talked about, that kind of reminded me of, how people used to want to be able to touch their physical money, and later on now they have this argument of, hey, Bitcoin is something I cannot see, I cannot smell, I cannot touch. Therefore, it probably doesn't worth that much. There are these group of pro-gold people. For example, people like Peter Schiff would argue that Bitcoin is just, you're trading nothing. Basically, that's what he said.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's a generational issue. People that grew up more in our generation, Facebook, Meta is a multi-trillion-dollar company, and their product is online. Same thing with most of the biggest stocks these days basically have a primarily online experience. Now they still have a physical component like their data centers, but the actual capex for that is pretty small relative to the total value and profits of the company, which mostly exists online. And of course, people. They will pay a lot of money for a skin in a video game, for example, as a status symbol or as aesthetic enjoyment, even though it doesn't exist in the real world, because that's where a lot of people spend their time. They spend hours of time online. And Bitcoin, I'd argue similar, which is in this telecom connected world, there's more we can do with Bitcoin than gold. I've historically, I'm a gold bull. I'm not like in the camp. There are some people in the camp that say buy Bitcoin, sell your gold. I'm like, okay, there's still use for gold as there's always been. But in the telecom connected world, we're having this conversation from, far apart. And Bitcoin bridges that gap. We can send a Bitcoin transaction back and forth here. We can't do the same thing with gold without some sort of credit as an intermediary. And Bitcoin, just like those big stocks like Facebook and Google and Amazon and all that, Bitcoin still has a physical presence. There are still Bitcoin miners that acquire energy, process it, and mine Bitcoin. There's still computers running nodes, and so there is a physical component, which makes sense for the world that we live in. There's proof of work, but of course, a lot of the value is the fact that it is digital.
根据 Pearson 2024年的全球调研报告呢，有 63% 的受访者认为如果提升英文的能力，他们的薪水最高可以加薪 50%。部分的人甚至预期加薪的幅度高达80%。想要随时随地呢利用生活零碎的时间加强英文的能力，可以试试看 ELSA Speak。它是 Google 投资一个用强大的生成式 AI 帮你练习英文口说沟通技巧的个人教练 App。不管你的程度在哪里，它都会根据你的需求跟喜好量身定做每一天的学习计划。比如说最初的这个个人化设定每一天的专属课程里面包含了文法、 法、词汇发音还有对话。你看这个文法练习呢，有各种情境来引导你练习造句，然后立刻就会纠正你需要调整的地方，示范更适合的句子跟用法。另外呢，还可以自己去自定啊，或者是挑选各种的情境，跟 AI 做深度的对话练习。
Well, I really appreciate that you answer these questions.
I appreciate your kind words.
另外 Premium 的网页版限定有长篇的口说神器 Speech Analyzer， 只要录一段英文口说呢，就可以立刻预测专业考试的口说分数，告诉你哪里要加强。如果你想要从基础开始学习，那可以从 ELSA Pro 的方案开始。如果想要从基础到进阶，完全都解锁 AI 的英语对话，还可以上雅思托福这些专业的英语课程，那 ELSA Premium 可能更适合你。现在资讯栏进去使用频道专属优惠码 BONNIE 就可以用比在 App 里面还要优惠的价格买到。从8月13号开始呢，限时7天 ELSA Pro 跟 ELSA Premium 的终身版方案还可以用将近4折的价格买到，超级优惠。记得这个优惠呢只限定于资讯栏的专属链接，现在就往更高的薪水之路迈进。
Okay, so on your YouTube channel, there is this excellent video called How Money and Banking Work and why they're broken today. So you talk about the 3-era gold standard, the Bretton Woods, and petrodollar system. My question is, are we entering this new era of course, Bitcoin is in the picture, but stablecoin, is that the next era of US dollar? And how, like, what role does stablecoin play today?
Yeah, I think partially. We can kind of categorize this. There's almost there are two ends of the spectrum. And one of my favorite citations in the book Broken Money is from William Stanley Jevons back in 1875. He wrote a book called Money and the Mechanism of Exchange. And this was right at the dawn of the telegraph era. He wrote that book like a decade after the cross-Atlantic telegraph cable was put into place. And one thing he pointed out was that almost every friction in finance is solved by another layer of centralization. So like if I want to send you money, it helps if we have the same bank because I can just tell the bank, debit my account, credit your account. If we have different banks, then it helps if our banks can talk to each other in some way to make that easier. So they often tie into a central bank. And if we're in different countries, then it helps if our central banks talk to each other and have a way to either use the same underlying ledger, maybe of whatever the biggest central bank is, to move that money around. And so there's really kind of like 4 layers of centralization that we've built up in the modern financial stack. Now, what Bitcoin is like most fintech today is like the top layer. It's a technological layer that runs on that whole layered stack. Fintech companies are ultimately still built on banks. They just abstract a lot of that away from us. And stablecoins are like that, which is that they add this kind of top layer of technological efficiency. They do solve a lot of issues. There are over 40 currencies in Africa. There are over 30 currencies in Latin America. There's plenty of currencies in Southeast Asia. There's these areas where there's very fractured currency markets, and there's a lot of demand for dollars. And basically what a stablecoin is it takes the idea of an offshore bank account, which used to only be available to the wealthy, and basically compresses the overhead, the cost of doing that, and makes that available to anyone with an internet connection. So the global working middle and upper middle classes, and that has ramifications. Bitcoin is different in the sense that it actually, instead of being a layer on top of that whole stack, it's a new parallel foundational layer. So it's basically the way to do central banking, but in a distributed way. So the ability to settle final value without ongoing. There's no single entity in control of that ledger. It's the whole group of miners and node runners that dictate how that ledger works. And so I do think that stable coins and to some extent CBDCs, because there's different ways to go about this. They kind of actually serve similar roles. They're kind of the final evolution of fiat currency. They're kind of the top of that whole 4-layer stack of centralization. And that's coming out, of course, at the same time, roughly speaking, as Bitcoin, which is a whole new foundation of a stack to build on.
So you talk about how there are different currencies. I want to bring up Nigeria. So in 2022, Nigerians were told that they could only spend $20 per week on things outside of their country. And later they're allowed a little more. I used to go to Nigeria, and there are 2 currency rates. So the black market rate and then the official rate. But my question will be, let's say USD stablecoin is now very popular everywhere in the world. What does this new world look like? Do they still use their currency, or is everybody just relying on US dollar?
Well, it gives them a lot of optionality. So they might not switch entirely to dollars, but now all of them have the option to access dollars more easily than they used to, and Bitcoin as well. And so, for example, if I wanted to hire a Nigerian graphic designer to do something, before, if I wanted to pay her, it would be subject to all these frictions. That official exchange rate would probably come into play, where basically the government kind of gets their percentage of it, often, I would say unfairly. Whereas now she can hold up a QR code on a video call or send me any sort of payment string, and whether she wants to be paid in stable coins or Bitcoin or whatever else, at the exchange rate that we decide, between me and that person, that just goes around whatever Nigeria wants to do. And so it really depowers the middleman, and empowers the people making individual decisions, which I think is good. One of the, I go to Egypt every year, and they've had similar periods of time where they have kind of an artificial peg of their currency with, like this exchange rate. And at times that no longer becomes sustainable. And so the gray market starts to deviate from what the official exchange rate is. So it might be 30 Egyptian pounds to the dollar officially, but then at the same time, if you actually wanted to get physical dollars on the streets of Cairo, you're gonna pay 50 Egyptian pounds for it. And things like stablecoins can go around that. And Nigeria and Egypt are interesting examples because they're both among the most populous countries in Africa. Nigeria is very much far into Bitcoin and stablecoins, very high adoption rates. Egypt is still low adoption rates. And basically, it just kind of shows the example of how people can get empowered by the technology to start, protecting themselves from their local currency debasement. Making cross-border trade just easier to do if you're running any sort of business or remittances that involve flowing across border. So it's in outright currency failure scenarios, it can involve fully getting out of the currency, but in many cases, it just involves getting part of your value out of the currency and giving that user more choice, which over time can chip away at a local national currency. And I would generally argue that this current period we live in with like 180 different currencies, that's mostly an artifact of this weird arbitrage that exists between fast transactions, historically no way to do fast settlements, and so we became reliant on these centralized ledgers. But as the world gets more internet connected and as these technologies like stablecoins and Bitcoins get big and liquid, so not just exist, but actually big and liquid enough and understood enough to matter, it starts to connect all of those and gradually, maybe not immediately, but gradually start making more and more of those currencies obsolete, and gravitating away from the weakest ones first probably, and then moving up the stack toward the biggest and strongest ones, as people want, they have more choice. They get out of their local monopoly with at least some of their value.
Can you explain why countries do capital control? Because sometimes I'm like, well, is stablecoin kind of against countries' interest, different countries' interest? For example, why does Nigerian government impose this capital control? Why?
So there's a trilemma in currencies where a country can pick its exchange rate, it can pick its interest rate, or it can have open capital markets. So capital can flow in and out pretty freely. And really, they can only pick two of those three. They can't really have all three. They have to sacrifice one in order to maintain the other two. And in a lot of countries' case, they're running monetary policy or fiscal policy that results in their currency devaluing. And they will often try to slow that process by mandating some sort of fake exchange rate. And that's basically seigniorage. That's the government kind of gradually trying to extract value from its citizens in ways that are more opaque than taxes. Basically, debasement is historically a type of tax that's just it's harder to measure, harder to quantify. Most people in a given country can't tell you what the money supply growth rate of their country is. It's just not something people look up on a regular basis. It's actually more impactful than official measures of inflation, because that's a number that's harder to game. And so as currencies devalue, often there are political leaders that say, well, I don't want the currency to devalue too sharply because then it'll be more apparent what's going on. So they try to prop it up, and then usually release it all at once later when they really don't have a choice. And just technology and awareness can kind of get around that and give people more optionality to get out of that before they're hit by it.
You've mentioned that money is how we store purchasing power in the future. I love that. And so that's why, it's really unfair for everyday people how, money supply increases so much. And you talk about how nothing stops the train. I want you to maybe explain to everybody what that means.
Right. There's probably two separate contexts for that. One is that every country has their own money supply growth rate. On average, developed countries will be growing at historically 6 to 8% per year. Obviously, during certain periods, like 5 years ago, there was accelerated growth rates in most places. But the multi-decade average for developed markets is something like 6 to 8%. In developing countries, it's often over 10%, many times way over 10%. And so basically what that represents is that everybody's savings are getting debased at whatever the rate is for their environment. But then also not just their savings, but also every single contract denominated in that currency is getting adjusted by the money printer. And so, if you work for a wage paid by someone else, and the money supply is growing, it's up to you to try to negotiate a higher wage every year, or more frequently sometimes, to try to keep up with that debasement rate. Because just by doing nothing, your actual purchasing power of your salary decreases, not just your savings. And that includes business pricing, that includes supply contracts between businesses, business to business type of contracts. And so in periods where there's environments where there's higher money supply growth rate, there's generally less productivity because there's more overhead that goes into more frequent contract negotiations, more slippage, more frictions, more people just trying to get capital out of that environment. So it's harder to invest. It's less desirable for capital to want to invest in that place because it's harder to do the numbers for what they're going to expect in return. And it damages productivity. When I talk about nothing stops this train, I generally specifically talk about U.S. fiscal deficits, which is that we're running structurally large fiscal deficits, both in absolute terms and as a percentage of GDP. And of course, this has some global implications because it's the global reserve currency. And so it impacts dollar debts and dollar savings around the world. Basically, there were periods of time in the US and elsewhere where the environment's under monetary dominance. So most new money supply is being created by fractional reserve bank lending. But then there are other times of fiscal dominance where the large fiscal deficits that the government's running, and when they need to, they monetize it, meaning they have their central bank increase the money supply and buy more of their bonds. That goes around the normal bank lending channels and basically runs things hot and on average more inflationary. And that's what the U.S. is currently in. And the reason I use the nothing stops this train statement originally from Breaking Bad, the TV show, is that it's very hard for the U.S. to get out of the situation anytime soon. So we're talking 5-10 years. I think they're still going to be in a period of structurally high fiscal deficits, which has implications both for Americans and for the whole world that in part uses the dollar as a base ledger.
So if it's designed to grow and grow, and the number is just, supposed to get bigger by design, why do you think there's a breaking point? Like, why are people talking about it? Why does it sound scary?
So I generally argue that the breaking point, to the extent it's there at all, is farther out than many bears expect. Because if I thought the breaking point was near, I wouldn't use the phrase "nothing stops this train." The point is that it's both bearish and bullish because it's basically saying that it's unfixable in the near term, but it's also not going to blow up in the near term. It's actually going to persist for quite a while, and that doesn't mean it's without consequences during that time. The consequences are happening the whole way. All the things we just discussed, as you increase the money supply, and especially as you do it through the fiscal channel, it basically means that those who are on the right side of the deficits are doing pretty well. And those who are not receiving the deficits are the ones getting debased and not being made up for in any given way. So that includes, on average, younger Americans that are, say, locked out of the home buying market. And that also includes the whole foreign sector that's using dollars. And it includes stablecoin holders, because stablecoin holders are generally not getting interest on their dollar holdings. And yet, the dollar supply is growing at a pretty meaningful rate per year, so they're getting diluted. And there's this kind of there's like a hierarchy of capital access, because if those who are well connected financially, such as a U.S. corporation, they will often issue dollar liabilities, and they'll buy something more scarce. It could be Bitcoin, it could be their own business equity, it could be another company. They're buying something that's higher yielding and more appreciating than the dollar, and they're willing to issue dollar debt with some interest to pay for it. Then you have people in other countries that they want to get out of their local currency. It could maybe the Nigerian currency, for example. They're getting into dollars, but they're often not getting a yield on their dollars, so they're still being debased relative to those that are in a position to buy even scarcer assets and that are shorting the dollar often to do it, like MicroStrategy is doing. They issue various dollar-denominated credit liabilities to get more Bitcoin and arbitrage the fact that over the long run, Bitcoin is outperforming the dollar. And the unfortunate thing about all that is it really kind of widens the gap. Because if you're in a position to own the scarcest things and short fiat currencies, you're doing pretty well. And if you're the one holding currencies and not in a position to really be issuing all these credit instruments or shorting the currencies, you're getting gradually debased, and you're on this treadmill trying to keep up. And that's kind of the issue behind broken money. That's why that's a big reason why the world has these kind of issues at the current time. And technology is gradually addressing that. But of course, it takes time, it takes network effects, it takes education, and it's ongoing.
It's broken because it's unfair. But what about for people that actually have assets? It favors them. They're happy that, everything that we talked about is happening because it just pumps up the price of my asset, right?
Yeah, and if you're in a position for it, like I'm in a position where the more the U.S. wants to debase itself, I'm okay because I'm short the dollar and I'm long other things. So if they want to debase it, that's fine. It's not necessarily good for societal health, though. I'd rather live in a society that's more harmonious and functional than one that's in disarray, but that those in the top 10% that have the best access to doing things like that are flourishing, and others are, it becomes dangerous to go anywhere because it's a messy environment now. So in the grand scheme of things, it's better to have a fair environment that you're doing well in than unfair environment that you're still beneficiary of, because that's kind of it might feel good in the short term, but longer term that's worse. And one of the things I kind of argue is that it's sort of an inevitable outcome of the mismatch we find ourselves in for this past century and a half, which is when you have fast transaction speeds, slow settlements, we're going to become very reliant on middlemen, banks and central banks, and we have been. And there really, for a century and a half, there really was no alternative. If you wanted to send money globally, how would you do it otherwise? But now, because of Bitcoin and for some countries, because of stable coins, they can get outside of at least their local monopoly and still relying on the dollar system, but at least outside of their local one, with Bitcoin being outside all of them, there's now more tools. And as those tools get 5 times bigger and more liquid and more understood, and then 10 times bigger and more liquid understood, it can gradually address this problem. Another way I kind of put it is that, for a lot of history, people, of course, get rewarded for doing something very productive, building the railroads or inventing electricity. And of course, that's a good thing. In the current era, in kind of this late stage fiat environment, the biggest rewards generally go to those that are arbitraging the system the most, or at least the lowest path to get there. So of course, it's still if you can invent the next, $100 billion idea, that's still the path toward the most riches. But generally speaking, if you want to get fairly wealthy, it was better to go to Wall Street than anywhere else. It was better to go into Wall Street than be an engineer or a doctor or in many cases, startup founder, unless you're going to be the top 1% of them. If you're going to go somewhere, the financial sector was just kind of a brain drain, drawing so many people toward it, because one of the best things you could do is borrow at 2% and buy assets that are going up at a significant rate, and otherwise kind of do financial engineering. And that's generally where you get more issues. And I think that over time, as Bitcoin gets bigger, as technology kind of levels the playing field, I think that arbitrage starts to shrink and returns things more toward, the engineers, the doctors, anyone who's in a position where they're actually improving people's lives in a meaningful way and therefore benefiting themselves in the process, versus those that are just kind of arbitraging inefficiencies or centralizations in the current system.
I know that you like writing sci-fi. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, it's fun.
I'd like to hear, okay, your imagination at work. Two versions of an idea monetary system. First is the most realistic, the one that we might be able to see within our lifetime. And the second one is something, more sci-fi, something that might happen if we start fresh on Mars, or, that's like the perfect scenario. What would it look like?
I think the realistic scenario for the foreseeable future is a gradual we've had this kind of fracturization where the whole world kind of used to, for a period of time, use gold and silver as money. And now we've got 180 different currencies. It's this fracturing that happened. And I think the most realistic path is that starts to condense again and starts to shrink, where the smallest, weakest currencies basically stop existing because there's no reason for people to be stuck in them anymore as their options improve and as more internet connectivity goes everywhere, more understanding goes everywhere. This has time to play out. People get into stable coins, they get into Bitcoin, they get into a larger local currency rather than whatever the smallest one is. And so this, I think, over years and decades, gradually starts to condense and people have more options and they're able to get into those better assets at more of an even playing field. And so I think the world looks like growing Bitcoin and then still coexisting alongside fiat currencies, but that the fiat side is gradually getting less in number, and people are more aware of not sticking too much value in it and starting to either hold other assets like Bitcoin, even pricing things in Bitcoin eventually. That's, I think, the nearer term over years and decades in our lifetime. I think the ideal scenario is just basically out of fiat currency altogether. Which is that we've closed the speed gap. We no longer need these big centralized ledgers, at least at the foundation. They're still sometimes used for centralization to higher layers. They can increase efficiency and they can provide services, but they don't need to be running the core layer itself. So whether we're on Earth or Mars, basically having some sort of foundational blockchain. On Earth, it's Bitcoin. Maybe on Mars it'll be different because of the delay, the time delay of signals between them. Basically, a foundational currency that is more transparent, more fair, doesn't have all of these host of issues I've described so far, and and people grow up in that environment, and that is just a normal thing. It's kind of crazy how fast technology changed in a century. So people went from literally in our grandparents' lifetimes using gold and silver or having money at least backed by it, where they think of it as proxies for gold and silver, to just floating paper currencies. And if you told people, these, in the future, in a couple decades, people will just be using paper as money or digital bits that are not backed by anything as money, it would have sounded crazy to a lot of people. And then yet now we grow up and think that's normal. And I think that the future world is one where people grow up and, it's something like Bitcoin exists and that's normal. And the idea of just a money that is created out of nothing and that people earn their paycheck in it and save it, that sounds weird to people. as like that's a crazy
Yeah.
thing that humans used to do, but we don't have to do anymore. That's I think the state we want to get to.
That kind of wipes out the stock market too. If the money supply is fixed, then is there a stock market or any financial activities, investments? Because a lot of people nowadays invest because they want to keep up the purchasing power. But what happens if the money supply is fixed?
They're still investing in that world. I think basically it becomes more optional because it becomes a way to take on risk to increase your net worth rather than something you have to do just to maintain your net worth. And so basically, and Jeff Booth and others have made this point that when money is weak, people monetize other things. They go and buy extra property. They go and buy gold. They go and buy fine art. They go and buy stocks. Whatever the case may be, as long as they're trying to get out of their local debasing fiat currency. If money is strong, like back in when it was gold or if it's Bitcoin, then the hurdle rate for wanting to get into other things is higher. Now it's not zero. I mean, it's not like infinite because if there's a profitable business or a business that has a good chance of becoming profitable, you can still earn more of the base layer by investing in something that is creating value and basically extracting value from elsewhere because it's doing something better than the existing system. So there's still winners and losers in that system, but instead of this kind of ongoing debasement that happens in the background, it's actually the real value moving around.
I want to talk about you because while I was doing research, something kept on coming up. It says you grew up in poverty and at times even without a home. I don't know if that's true. You can tell me the story. Growing up, I want to know what your relationship with money is. When do you start learning to invest or save? What was the financial education like?
Sure. So when I was living with my mother, we were homeless for a period of time. So we lived in homeless shelters. First we lived with a relative, then we lived in homeless shelters, then we lived in worse homeless shelters, then we lived briefly in a motel, and then we briefly were in a car, and that's when I went to live with my father. So I exited being homeless, and I grew up then in a trailer park, which was an upgrade. And at that time, I became way interested in saving and investing, which I guess is not surprising because I was in that kind of more chaotic environment, the environment of scarcity. And so when I this was when I was say 4 to 6, I was homeless. So by the time I was 7, 8, I was growing up in a trailer park, but things were more stable there. And so when I would get Christmas presents or birthday presents and have some cash, I would generally save it. I got into coin collecting, so gold and silver coins. I guess I was an early gold bug, in the 90s. And then by the time I was a late teenager, I got into equities. I started to buy stocks. And so I think that, a lot of times there is a silver lining to something that is on its surface a negative thing, which for me was it got me interested in thinking about the future, saving for the future. And of course, it is now the career path that I focus on is not only investing, but studying the very nature of what money is, how to make good money, what is the history of money, how can money change to benefit more people? So I try to look on the bright side of everything.
Would you say your investment style lean towards more conservative? Because if you've gone through that, you don't want to lose your money.
I think it has leaned conservative for my age. And so many, I don't really go all into anything, no matter the conviction level, because I never put myself in a position where I'm focusing entirely on one asset. And I think because I have that background with gold and silver, more so than most people my age, it's not something I just say I want to own zero of, even though, of course, way more focused elsewhere. And so I do think that there's always some degree of diversification for me, which is probably part of that background. But I still, when I have a high conviction on something, I still put a big percentage of my time and capital into it. And so, based on most standards, the amount that I've kind of say focused on Bitcoin and the percentage of my net worth that Bitcoin's become, and as it kind of does its crazy volatility, I was on stage at Pacific Bitcoin in November 2022 while FTX was crashing, and we were having a great time. So it's not like and it's because of my more conservative style of doing things that even when it seems like the world's crashing and volatility is happening, that's where the benefit of that approach happens, where I'm in a position to say buy more or otherwise just not really be that concerned about the volatility because, the whole net worth isn't necessarily fluctuating by that percentage, even though a big chunk might be. And I think it helps think clearly and be helpful in that regard.
May this year you posted my 16-year-old Hyundai is finally starting to fail, and you decided to join the rich life and get a Toyota.
Yes.
First thought, I was like, damn, Hyundai lasts for a long time. And then second thought was, I'm curious just how your values and how you view money evolves over time. Like when people get to a certain level of wealth, they're like, I need to enjoy life. I might want to upgrade my car, my house, and stuff like that. What is your view on that?
So I think people should pursue their passions. There's certain types of things that I think make sense more than others, which is, generally speaking, it's not good to chase status symbols. So if something is not something that you personally enjoy, but you want to signal to others, that's usually not the best use of money. Often a really good use of money is curing pain points. And people have different pain points. So for me, I didn't really care much about my car. I don't do a ton of driving. I'm not a car enthusiast. It's different than if someone is a car enthusiast. And so for me, it was kind of like, it was just, point A to point B, spend as little value on it as possible, especially when I was, I went through college, I had student loans, then I was working as an entry-level engineer and then gradually kind of working my way up the hierarchy. So by having just this boring car with no car payments, it helped me save elsewhere. But then even when I was in a position to upgrade it with no problem, I was like, well, that's time and hassle. It's nice having a car that if someone bangs into it, I don't care. My concern is elsewhere. And so I kind of took pride in the driving a 1600 Hyundai until I couldn't do it anymore. But at the same time, for example, like for me, a pain point is traveling. And so I would invest in better seats or just better ways of traveling around, which many people might say would be excessive. Whereas for me, it's like that's solving a problem enough that I actually want to go on the trip that I might have otherwise not gone on. So I think it's my main kind of advice to people would be conscious of where spending money actually gives you an impact, rather than just do things on autopilot because it's considered normal. So it's often considered normal that if you reach a certain wealth level, your house has to look a certain way, your condo has to look a certain way, your car has to look a certain way, you're wearing certain things that signal, people get kind of caught up in that treadmill. You don't have to do that, and instead you can just pick and choose which areas actually don't matter to you and which areas are actually places where spending money makes a really big difference and makes you happier.
I want to share a story with you. So I've actually spent some time in Egypt. And you're talking about how, your car, you're not afraid of your car being bumped. Every car in Cairo looks like it just came out of a bumper car match. It's crazy, super wild.
Yeah.
I was working on a school project where we could choose any topic we wanted. And I really wanted to go to Egypt. So I just told my professor and my parents that, I was doing research there. And that was during the Second Egyptian Revolution. And that was when I realized I saw how resilient people were. And Egypt has always hold a very special place in my heart. And I want to know your relationship. You have roots and families and friends in Egypt, right?
Yeah, my husband's originally from there. And so all of my in-laws are Egyptian. And then, of course, I have a lot of friends in Egypt. So we spend part of each year there. And I agree with you. It's a very resilient place. It kind of shows how life can continue even as things are chaotic around you. And then even just in the past 5 years, so where there's been, say way less political instability, they were dealing at one point with 38% inflation. The money supply growing by 20+% per year on a sustained basis. And life was still going on. There's still people doing all the normal things that you expect, even though a lot of people were in pain. And I often just use it as an example of broken money, because it shows how the ledger that people are kind of forced to use can really create these malinvestments or headwinds against productivity, so that through no fault of their own, there are frictions. And one of the saddest things is, like, I mean, I know, for example, doctors in Egypt, where they were just, how do they save money? They go to the gray market, they buy physical dollars, they stash them in their apartment, and that, in the 21st century, that's what they consider the best savings technology available to them. And then many of them would, as soon as they get the opportunity, they travel elsewhere to try to get more income, because the economic activity, like optionality in Egypt is more limited, and it's often just because there's these frictions or these headwinds that don't have to be there. So I think for a lot of investors, especially, traveling really broadens your view of things and gives you insights that people that are doing things just in their own country don't necessarily have. And I think it's really valuable.
And now we have AI. It sounds so different. It's like two different worlds. We have AI, and some people argue that, AI will be so productive where everything will be almost free. Like everything will be so cheap, it will be almost free, and we will have so much time that we don't know what to do with ourselves. Is this statement true or false? And how would that change inflation and money?
Well, it's interesting. There are people making somewhat similar arguments a century ago, as we entered kind of the Industrial Revolution at scale, where they said, right now the work week is high, but in the future it'll get down to maybe 10, 15 hours a week, and people have all this free time. And instead, people are working often more than 50 years ago in many cases. And there was this, technology greatly changes what we spend our time on. And so, for example, it used to be that a very high percentage of people worked in agriculture. But as people invented tractors and all these other equipment, we automated 90+% of that. So now something like 1 or 2% of people work in agriculture and feed the other 98%. Because of the massive productivity gain. And that, of course, extended to textiles. The percentage of people that have to work in textiles has just dramatically fallen. Then people go into other fields. And I do think that we're entering an era where that will start happening, is already happening to some types of white-collar work, which is that things that used to require a lot of human labor, not that they necessarily need zero human labor, but that they can make it so that 1 or 2 people can do the work of 10 people. Because they're overseeing a lot of automation to do certain things that used to be very labor intensive. And that, of course, can be disruptive when it happens quickly, as it was in the past. But then it gives more people time to do elsewhere. The big risk where I think it starts to maybe change the game, where I wouldn't be too dismissive, is that it can eventually get to a point where something like 50% of people would not necessarily be able to do something in any capacity that a machine can't do, and therefore might have trouble securing economic stability for themselves and their family. And then it becomes very hard to get out of that cycle. That's probably the risk I would worry about the most in that capacity. So I do think that we're overall entering a period where there's a whole new stack of things we can automate that makes those things more abundant and cheaper. But that comes with disruption. I don't really hold the view that like things are going to be nearly free, because there still is a very big physical component to life. It's still energy intensive, material intensive, to build a house, to transport things, to make high quality goods, to provide high quality healthcare. A lot of that still has a very real input that AI can't, software can iterate very quickly, but anything in the real world takes time. It takes like 20 years to bring on a copper mine from scratch, for example. Even manufacturing is very energy intensive. In the U.S. right now, of course, as we try to ramp up all this data center for AI, there's like a 5+ year backlog of getting electrical parts, often from China, to build some of the electrical transmission things we need, or data center things we need, just to do that. And that's like the bottlenecks that people that work strictly in AI might not first think about. And they say, oh, wait, this actually touches the real world. We actually have to figure out where we're going to get the copper, where are we going to get the transformer, where are we going to get the electricity on a stable, inexpensive basis. So there still is a real world constraint, and it just kind of changes in many cases where we work and where we spend our time.
There is this narrative that I've seen quite often online these days. The biggest asset that rich people have are poor people, and the system, the education help produce employee, and the rich intend to keep it that way. What do you think?
I think there's truth to that. As we entered the Industrial Revolution, and different countries entered at different kind of phases. But as a place enters an Industrial Revolution, at first it becomes like a lot of the education system reorients around a couple key things. While the parents are at work, someone has to watch the kids, and so instead of the family doing it themselves, we kind of scale the process up. And so we make schooling, and then while they're at school, we train the children so that when they grow up, they are ready for jobs in that environment. And we generally don't train things like how to become an entrepreneur or things like that. It's basically how to pass all the tests, how to follow instructions, how to know enough things that, depending on what your capacities are, you can work in these different areas. So I do think that there's some truth to that. Often it's kind of the byproduct of no one's necessarily intentionally designing it that way, or at least not always. And instead people's individual incentives kind of click that into place until you get to a new technological era where that doesn't make sense anymore. And people either want new things or new things become possible. And another thing is going back to the kind of the prior point about ledgers. Part of it is that I would say one of the biggest resources that rich people have is the ability to short the currency at cheap rates. So if you're impoverished and you borrow, you're often borrowing in, say, credit cards, you're paying a very high interest rates. But if you're a well-capitalized individual or corporation, you're often borrowing at a very low interest rate and with very good terms. Like it's not going to be called away from you at an inopportune time and force you to sell due to volatility. And what that means is that if there are people that are, for lack of better options, holding currency that you're shorting, you're kind of gradually extracting value from them. So that's kind of an indirect way where the wealthy benefit from the poor because they're shorting the thing that other people are earning their wages in. And that creates an unhealthy dynamic. So I think part of that is the broken money itself. That doesn't have to be there. That can be fixed, in my opinion. Things can be made more transparent and a more even playing field. And there are other things that are maybe just more entrenched, that as a society develops and goes through a certain phase, there are certain frictions that happen that we can hopefully move past and improve.
What is your advice for an average person that's watching? A person could be watching our conversation and freaking out. What is your advice to them?
It depends on where they are in life, of course. Advice will differ. I'd say the two main things. One would be financial, which is basically try to own scarce things, and then if possible, short unscarce things, safely. That's kind of the rule of thumb. Is always kind of ask the question: am I being diluted? And if so, how can I stop that from happening or minimize that from happening? So if you're holding an asset where the supply is growing at 7% and you're getting 4% interest on it, you're getting diluted at a net rate of about 3%. You're owning a smaller share of that ledger from holding it over time. And that applies whether it's gold, whether it's stable coins, whether it's local currency. Sometimes if it's stock, always ask the question, am I getting diluted relative to the whole pie of whatever this thing is? And if it's possible, can I short something that is getting diluted so I'm benefiting from that dilution and owning scarcer things? From a broader perspective, I think that as AI and other things can make certain digital things and certain repetition things automated, it ironically brings back some of the real world expertise. So one thing to keep in mind is that portable AI is like 1,000 times harder than data center AI. So like
Explain that.
yeah, so the brain runs on about 20 watts of power, so less than an incandescent light bulb. And some of our top supercomputers, like there's different estimates for how many calculations per second a brain does. There's you can look at the number of neurons, the number of connections, and then there's estimates. And only kind of in this past several years have our best supercomputers reached roughly the level that most people think that the number of calculations a brain does. Now, obviously, in certain areas, it's way better. Like, it can calculate, 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000,000 times a trillion faster than we can do. But if you consider how much signal you're taking in, so all the different senses you're doing, all the different things your brain's doing to stand upright, to understand the world around it, while constantly thinking about something and solving a problem, that's actually a really high bandwidth, high processing thing that you're doing that's actually pretty hard for computers to do. And those supercomputers that kind of, obviously in some ways surpass humans, but in other ways just are still catching up to humans, they operate on something like 20 megawatts of power compared to 20 watts of power. So they need about
Wow.
1,000,000 times more energy to do something like the same amount of calculations per second. Obviously,
Wow.
again, in certain areas, they're way better, certain areas, they're worse. But so when you think of something that an AI data center can do, then the question is, well, if I want to put that into a robot, how hard is that? Because now in a robot, the power really matters. Something that that might take kilowatts of energy to do, you want to happen in watts, and so anything that involves a data center or that involves robots in a very controlled environment, like a manufacturing facility, that is way easier than automating things out in the field. Because out in the field, that power density really matters. And so it takes a lot more time and technology to compress that, like Moore's Law. And everything gets way harder. So it's easier to automate an industrial arm building cars in a clean environment where technicians can help with edge cases as needed, versus having a car drive itself across all manner of roads in the world, and avoiding hitting a dog, and being able to navigate every type of sign that's out there, and all the edge cases, and things like that. Like you mentioned Egypt. Imagine trying to self-drive in Cairo, for example. That's maybe in a very clean environment, it's possible, but the messier you get, the harder it is to do. And that's where humans still have an edge, and I think we're going to have an edge for quite a while. So ironically, some really skilled blue-collar work that's out in the field, I think, is some of the most resistant to AI taking jobs, and also just being a very well-rounded person, and using the fact that you're a portable person, you're energy efficient, and so you might not be able to compete with a data center on many things, but you can go into the real world and affect things in a way that is far less energy efficient for AI alone to do, at least any time in the next couple decades.
That ending is so powerful. I love it. Okay, so the publisher want me to do something. We're giving away 3 copies of your book, and I want people to maybe comment down below what they learned, from this conversation, because I've learned so much. And we're gonna select 3 viewers to give this book away. 货币失能, Broken Money. Yeah. Thank you so much. It was such a great conversation.
Thanks
Please
for
come
having me.
back soon.
Happy to.